Hey, it's Sean from Tested. We're back with another show and tell, another one of my little side hobbies and collections of old movie cameras. For those of you who don't know, before I moved out here and started working with Tested, I worked at NYU Film and TV for many, many years. I was the shop technician, and I was in charge of fixing and repairing and keeping everything going, including some of these old cameras. And between that and I went to school for film, and I love, love, love these old mechanisms and pieces of machinery and history. And they're just beautifully crafted and made, and were built to last. So thought it would be fun to look at how they work and show off one of the more popular cameras. And yeah, so let's dive in. So these two right here are Bolex cameras made in Switzerland. And Bolex has been making cameras for decades. At the company as we know it has been around since like the early 30s. And they were marketing towards mainly for a long time like amateur movie makers and home movies and stuff like that. Because before video cameras and stuff, if you're going to do home movies, it was going to be a film camera. So I think it's worth, before we talk about exactly how these ones work, it's worth talking about how the movie cameras in general worked, because not everybody knows. So most modern motion pictures, until everything started going digital, were shot on 35 millimeter film. And that's literally just how wide the film is, 35 millimeters wide. So the bigger the film, the more resolution you can get, the bigger you can blow it up so you can project it on a nice big screen and it looks good. What we have here today are 16 millimeter cameras, which is this stuff right here. So 16 millimeter wide film. And then you probably have heard of 8 millimeter film too, which is obviously half the width of this. So right here, what we have is double perf 16 millimeter film. And the perforations are there that engage with the sprocket mechanism in the camera that basically drive the film through the camera. So that's why the sprockets are there. And it needs to be that precise because it is being timed with a shutter opening and closing to expose each frame. And if it wasn't that sprocketed, really controlled mechanism, it wouldn't be a consistent image quality. So this is a celluloid plasticky film with a chemical coating on one side that's light sensitive. So this film would get run through the camera, and the light would hit the chemicals and make it react and cause an image to be burned in there, a negative image, if you were shooting negative. So I have a camera mechanism here that just kind of show you how the insides work. This is not from a Bolex, this is from an ARES, which we're gonna look at in another show and tell, but this gives you a good idea of how the things work. So basically, we have this little door here. This is the pressure plate, which pushes against the film, and it pushes against the aperture or the gate right here, which is where the image comes through from the lenses. And you close that pressure plate down, it pushes the film nice and flat against that, keeps it still. And as the camera runs, so the motor would be running it right here at this coupler, there is a pull down claw. So it's just literally a little claw that engages in each one of these sprockets and pulls it down to the next frame. This particular camera, you'll notice it seems to have two claws. That's because this upper one is a registration pin. So what that does is the bottom claw pulls the frame into place. The registration pin then goes and locks in another sprocket hole and locks it rock steady, so you get a nice crisp picture. Not all cameras have a registration pin. That tended to be on the fancier cameras, but it's a nice feature to ensure optimal picture quality. So then, as the film is being pulled frame by frame, we have a shutter. Now, they differ in different cameras. The Bolex has a much different shutter mechanism set up than this, but this is an actual glass shutter mechanism that is mirror coated, and this one's called a bow tie shutter. And when you talk about shutter angle, it's literally talking about the angle is getting exposed in this circle. So this is a 180-degree shutter. And basically what will happen is it is exposing the film right now because the light is coming through the lens and hitting the film. And then as the pull down claw pulls the film to the next frame, the shutter closes and blocks all light from it so that it doesn't expose it as it's moving. And then what the mirror does is it bounces that image back through this prism and into your viewfinder so you can actually see what you're shooting. So it just alternates that. It alternates taking an image, bouncing the image, taking an image, bouncing the image. So when you're looking through and actually shooting, it kind of flickers a little bit because of that open and close. And just a little film tidbit, these little black stripes on it are painted on there to reduce the flicker effect in the eyepiece to make it a little more comfortable to look at. So it just keeps doing this 24 times a second. It's 24 frames per second. So it takes 24 images per second, which is crazy. And it just buzzes the film through like that. So that's the film mechanism. And basically all cameras, movie cameras work about the same way as far as like exposing, blocking, and then some had more advanced features than others. So let's take a look at the Bolex. These are really cool cameras, Swiss made, beautifully engineered. They're like a Swiss clock inside. They're basically a clockwork mechanism inside because these run on springs. These are completely spring driven, no batteries. You literally crank it up and it will run the film through the camera on a giant spring. So I have two different ones here. This guy is the H16 Supreme. This is from approximately 1956, 16 millimeter camera. And then this is the Rex 5, which is probably, this guy's probably around 1968, but they made the Rex 5 like from the 60s through the 80s in virtually the same configuration. And common things between all the Bolexes is they have this, they have a turret mechanism. So these are all prime lenses, meaning that they are a fixed focal length. So there is a wide lens, a normal lens, and a telephoto lens. And then you'd basically rotate the turret in front of the film plane, which is right here, to pick which lens you want to shoot with. And then it has focus and aperture control, which is controlling how much light comes in. So turret mechanism has a little lever that help turn it, right? And this has a, this is confusing because you'll notice it has these two, it seems to have two viewfinders, which is like, huh, that's weird. But this is an old enough camera that this didn't actually look through the lens. This was strictly here to focus with. So this is kind of hard to wrap your mind around, especially in the day and age of digital cameras. But most cameras that look through the lens are a reflex camera, so they're looking through the lens. This one, you would take the lens off that you wanted to focus with, and you would mount it up here in front of this. So you'd put this one in front. You'd then be seeing through this one up here and focus the lens. So this isn't actually in front of the film at this point, it's just focusing the lens. Then you would position your lens in front of the film to shoot, and then you had this, which is your parallax viewfinder. And you would dial in what focal length lens you were using, so say like 25 millimeter lens, and then this is what you would use to frame your shot, which is crazy. So this isn't 100%, but it would get you really close to the framing of the actual film. And you're like, well, why the heck would you do it this way? And it's because to do a reflex camera, especially in something this compact, is tricky to do. It's hard to cram all that stuff because it usually involves mirrors and prisms and stuff like that, looking at the big mechanism we did. So that's why all of this stuff had to be done this way. So that was the early version. So we're going to spend most of our time looking at the newer Rex 5 version. So it's Rex was because they're reflex cameras. So this one actually does look through the lens. So when you look through this, you are actually seeing through the lens here. And the way they did this is kind of genius. because you're thinking, how in the heck do you fit a mirror shutter in this small space? So the way they did it, this is a little filter slide. You could put color filters in front of the lens. It has this prism in it. So if I flip this open, you can see how thick it is. It's probably about 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 inch thick prism. And so what happens is the film is right behind there. The light comes through the lens, it goes through the film, but it bounces a part of that light up through the top of the prism and into the viewfinder system. So that's how you can see what you are shooting. This made the Bolex a little unique because you lost 1/3 of a stop of light to the prism to bounce it into the viewfinder. So you have to set your f-stop at a little bit different exposure than you would on any other camera. And of course, film students always forgot that, and your footage always came back dark every time. But it was kind of a genius way of doing things and fitting it in a very small space. Other than that, the turret still works the same idea. You rotate it in place and all that. And then the viewfinder can be focused to your eye. So like someone like me, I can take my glasses off, focus the eyepiece for me, and I can see okay. So let's look. This got a ton of stuff here on the side. So let's kind of walk through the stuff. One of the really cool things about the Bolex was for a quote unquote consumer camera, you could do a ton of stuff with this that you couldn't even do on some like really fancy professional cameras. So one of those, let me wind it up first. So this is your fold out crank. You open it up, crank your camera up. So there's a giant coil spring in here that we are winding up very much like a clock. When it stops, you put it in place. So I'll run it here for a second. All right. You can then set your speed, your film speed down here. So 24 frames a second was standard for motion picture. So you could set it to that, but this would also go up to 64 frames a second, which allows you to do slow-mo. And then you can go down to 12 frames a second, which makes everything move really fast. This had a really wide range of speed for such a small camera, which a lot of cameras just shot at 24. This is a wild camera, also an MOS camera. MOS usually means that it's a camera that you shoot without sound, either because it's super loud or it's a wild camera, meaning that it's not super precisely controlled, which means it's hard to sync up with audio because you would record the audio on a tape recorder. And cameras that you would shoot like for movies and dialogue were engineered to be super, super quiet, which drove the price up. And they were crystal controlled, which means there was a crystal that drove the motor at a super precise speed so that it would sync up with the audio. So this you could do short bursts of audio, but it was always tricky. But the other thing that this camera can do, which a lot can't, is hear this. I can take one picture with it. So you can do two things. You can do animation. So these were great animation cameras. You could get a little cable release and you could do stop motion animation, which is, there's just many cameras you couldn't do that with. And if you went the opposite way, so this you can hear, it's like a click, click camera, click, click, click. But if I do this, you can hold the shutter open for as long as you want. So you could do timed exposure, like stars moving across the sky. You could do all kinds of really cool stuff. The other thing you could do is you could disengage the motor, and then you could use a crank to rewind the film. And so you could do double exposures, like special effects where you'd black out part of your film and then superimpose something else on it. You could do things in reverse. And it even has this little fade lever, which it basically is a variable shutter, meaning you can vary how wide the shutter opening is and down to completely closed. So you could do in-camera fades and dissolves, which is really cool. Or you could actually completely close the shutter if you needed to like rewind the film or cap it off or anything like that. So just the amount of stuff you could do on this thing was really amazing. The way these work inside. Okay, so we have a light tight door, which is important because You can't have any stray light hitting your film or you will get fogged or double exposures. And these use daylight spools. So typical 16 millimeter cameras typically shot on 400 feet of film. And it was literally just a roll of exposed film. Like if I was holding it up, you could see the edges of the film. And you'd have to load these inside a black, light tight bag, a changing bag. And you'd have to be really good at loading magazines where the film sits, because you're doing it in the dark and you're doing it all by feel. And you did that so none of the film was exposed. And then when you were done shooting, you had to do the same thing. Take it back in the bag, doing it in the dark, put it in a can, tape the can shut, and then send it to the lab to get processed. So what they did to make things a little more user-friendly was made daylight spools. So they come in this little light tight black box, and they'd come wound on these metal spools. And it's kind of staggered winding, so it's super tight against the sides here in low light conditions. So you wouldn't want to do this like right out in the middle of the sun. But if we were in here or in the shade, you can take this out of the box and load your camera, and all you're exposing is the little bit that you pull off to actually load the camera. So these are a little more user-friendly. Same thing, you take them out, you would lose the last few wraps of film, and you put it in your little black box and send it to the lab. So 100 feet of film is just a little over 2.5 minutes worth of footage, which is mind-blowing in this day and age when you can just shoot hours and hours on your phone. A 400-foot reel would maybe get you about 11 minutes. So you had to, plan out your shots a little bit more than you would normally. So let's take a look at this mechanism because it's fascinating. So right here is a spool eject mechanism to pop the spools out. If we pull back this is our pressure plate, just like the other one that we looked at, and you'd always have to make sure that it's snapped into place. This is where you load the film. So let's load it up and show you how it works. So they put a few little features in here which are really cool for such a small camera. Number one, down here in the bottom is a film cutter. That's right. So it lets you snap the film off at an angle, which this angle is ideal for loading the camera, because this camera also has an automatic loading feature, which is super nice. So you swing this lever down, and this engages these, which are called the loop formers. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But then it's showing you what direction the film has to come off the spool. So we're going to match it. And it has a square peg that you just snap it on. And then we have toothed sprockets on the top and bottom. And we're going to feed our film through, and I'm going to reach around here on the side and load it. And here we go. There we go. So when you close the door, it hits this button right here. And what that does is it releases these loop formers like that. And you'll see that we have these loops of film at the top and bottom. Pretty much all film cameras have to have that because the film is moving through so fast, it needs that little bit of wiggle room to let the film move around a little bit. If this was a tight, like angular path, it would snap the film immediately when you started the camera. So it has to have these little loops that give it the breathing room. Most cameras, you have to set those by hand or by following a diagram that's inside the camera. This had automatic ones, which is nice. So typically I would run a little bit of film off, maybe about a foot or so. There's a slot in the daylight spool that we're gonna stick that in and wind it up. The number one thing that beginners do is they don't wind up enough film on this, which means when this starts turning, it's not actually taking up the film, and you open this up and spaghetti comes out. Like it's all accordioned up because it didn't take up on the spool and you've ruined all your film. So make sure, give it a little tug, make sure it's on there. Put it on the other one. We've already disengaged the loop formers. There we go. So on going 24 frames a second on one crank, you get about 28 seconds of runtime, which once again, crazy, I know. So you really had to work out your shots. Like if you're doing a narrative film, you really had to work out your shots and storyboard them and time everything so that you didn't run out of crank. So let me crank it up to 664. See how that looks. Oh, pretty cool. All right, so once you had your film loaded, you wouldn't run off that much. You'd put your door back on. If you're being super duper paranoid, you may also put black tape around it just to prevent any light leaks. That typically didn't happen on these unless you had damaged or dropped or dented the door or something. And then has a counter here on the other side, and you would run the camera. So we're gonna put it back to 24. You'd run the camera until it got to, oh, I ran out of crank. You'd run the camera until you got to 0. And what it's doing is it knows that since you loaded the camera in light, you exposed a few feet of film on that outer layer of film, and it needs to clear that to nice clean film so that you don't mess up any of your footage. Same thing when you are done shooting, you always have to keep in mind that you're gonna lose that last shot that the film ran out on. But basically you'd run it till it got to 0 so that you knew that you were all clear and ready to go. But like, yeah, you do so many cool things with this: animation, time lapse, different speeds, slow-mo, fast-mo, and it's just a beautifully built piece of machinery. So the Bolex 16mm camera. Just to wrap things up, I thought to bring this guy in just for kicks because it's kind of the Bolex knockoff. This is straight from the Soviet Union. This is the Krasgonorris, I may be butchering that, Krasgonorris K3 camera. This was super popular. They made these a ton. These are made from 1971 through 1993. They made over 100,000 of these. And it works very similar to the Bolex. It cranks, it winds up on a spring. This particular one has a zoom lens on it. It also used daylight spools. Mine's probably like in the early 90s based on the serial number. And it can go from 8 to 48 frames a second, so comparable to the Bolex. Also uses the daylight spools, but you can get these on eBay like for super cheap, and they come with a ton of accessories like shoulder mount, hand grip. You know, the zoom lens is not bad, but the level of craftsmanship tends to be a little not quite the same level as the Bolex. So for example, we look at the daylight spools are kind of made of this bendy plastic instead of the metal and stuff like that. And this is the button that resets the loop formers, very much like on the Bolex. And on mine, when you do that, the door kind of sticks up a little bit, so you need to make sure you tape it. So this is a viable, cheap way to get into 16mm filming, but it's kind of a relic of the past, and I dearly love it for what it is, and it can do a very good job. So the K3. And you'll be happy to know that Kodak is still making film. You can still get 16mm film. They actually just are making reversal again, which they hadn't for a little while. They don't have as wide a range, but it's still out there, and you can still do it if you want to get that film look or just mess around or, do some animation or something. So, and Bolex is still fixing cameras. They don't make them anymore, but they still fix them, which is fantastic. So the Bolex, the K3, 16mm wind-up cameras. I hope you've enjoyed this show and tell. If you have any questions, put them in the comments and I'll try to answer them. Till next time, this is Sean from Tested.